South Jamaica, Queens. Sometime in the late 1970s, a man is walking down 150th Street. He has long straightened hair, pale light brown skin, a reddish birthmark just above his mouth. He moves through the block the way a man moves when he knows exactly what he is and has nothing to prove. The moment he turns onto the strip, something happens. Young hustlers start calling out, one voice first, then another, then the whole block rippling with it. Hey, hey, Ronnie's over here, they're paying homage, to a man who doesn't even slow down to acknowledge it. Because here is the thing about Ronald Bassett, the man who would eventually be known across all 5 boroughs as Ronnie Bumps. He didn't care about being known, he cared about one thing, the cash. That specific quality, that particular indifference to the street fame that every man around him was desperate to accumulate, is what made him one of the most extraordinary operators South Jamaica Queens ever produced. And here is what South Jamaica Queens will never fully admit. Without that man walking down 150th Street, without that man who looked exactly like Ron O'Neal playing Priest in Superfly, there is no Lorenzo Fat Cat Nichols. There is no Kenneth Supreme McGriff. There is no Supreme Team generating $200,000 per day. The entire mythology of Queens drug royalty that 50 Cent would eventually put on wax, the names and stories that defined the borough's underground economy for a generation, traces back to one man. A man who didn't even want his name in the song. This is the story of Ronnie Bumps Bassett, the architect of Queens. Before Bumps, there was Pops, John Freeman, the man Queens called Pops Freeman. In the 1960s and early 70s, when Queens' drug trade was being established, when the specific geography of South Jamaica and Hollis and the corridors that would eventually produce one of the most dangerous underground economies in New York City history was being mapped, Pops Freeman was the man who ran it, not alone. With connections, Pops Freeman had established deep ties with the Genovese family, one of New York's 5 Italian organized crime families, the organization that would eventually be described by the FBI as the most powerful and sophisticated of all 5. In the 60s, according to rumor that circulated through Queens street world, Pops had actually been set up in business by Vito Genovese himself. The Italian mob. In Queens, feeding a black operation. That arrangement was not generosity, it was business. The Italians controlled the heroin supply chain in the 1960s through their connections to the Sicilian Mafia and the French Connection Pipeline. If you wanted to run a significant drug operation in New York, you needed their product, which meant you needed their permission, which meant you paid them their percentage and operated at a level they approved. Pops Freeman operated within that structure for years, built something real, built something that Queens respected. But by the late 1970s, Pops Freeman was aging out. The game had changed around him. New men had emerged. New money was moving. And the structure he had built, the network, the connections, the specific organizational architecture that made Queens' drug trade function, needed new leadership. Pops Freeman looked at the men around him. He chose Ronald Bassett, not as a junior partner, not as an employee being promoted. As a successor, he handed Bumps the entire operation, the network, the connections, the Italian mob pipeline that had been the foundation of Queens' drug trade since the 60s. Everything around 1979, and what Bumps did with that inheritance, how he transformed what Pops Freeman had built into something none of them had imagined, is the story that Queens never told properly. Here is the move that nobody in Queens fully understood when Bumps made it. He cut the Italians off, not gradually, not partially, not while maintaining the relationship as a backup option. Completely. A black man from Hollis, Queens, who had just inherited the most significant drug operation in the borough, looked at the Italian mob pipeline that had been the foundation of everything Pops Freeman built, and decided he did not need it. Think about what that decision required. The Italian mob in the late 1970s was not an organization you walked away from over a business disagreement. These were the men who had structured New York's entire drug trade for decades, who had the supply chain, who had the violence infrastructure, who had demonstrated repeatedly and publicly what happened to people who decided they were done paying the percentage. Bumps saw something they did not see. The cocaine era was arriving. The heroin pipelines that the Italian mob had controlled for decades were becoming less critical as Colombian cocaine began flooding American cities. New supply chains were being established. Direct relationships between American operators and Colombian suppliers, cutting out every layer of Italian middleman, were suddenly possible in ways they had not been before. Bumps moved. He went direct to Colombian suppliers, not through the Italians, not through anyone else's relationship, his own direct line. The move did what all great strategic decisions do. It changed his price. When you buy through a middleman, you pay for the middleman, their margin, their risk, their infrastructure. The Italians were not fronting product out of generosity. Every kilo that moved through their pipeline generated revenue for them. When Bumps went direct, the Colombian's price came straight to him. His product was better, his prices were lower, his margins were larger. And because his margins were larger, he could do something that separated him from almost every other operator in Queens. He could build people up, not just move product. He could build an entire ecosystem of operators underneath him who could generate revenue he shared in, while the product he controlled kept flowing through their operations. The architect was building the city. By the early 1980s, Ronnie Bumps Bassett was running something that the Queen Street world had never seen before. More than 100 employees, numbers and drug rackets operating out of at least 9 separate outlets spread across Queens. 100 people, 9 locations. One man's organizational architecture holding it all together. The Queens hustler who was quoted about Bumps in the book Queens Reigns Supreme, Ethan Brown's definitive account of South Jamaica's drug royalty, said something that has stuck to Bumps's name ever since. Nicky Barnes was more flamboyant, but Ronnie was big. Ronnie was up there. Nicky Barnes, the man whose face went on the cover of the New York Times Magazine, the man whose notoriety triggered a personal order from President Jimmy Carter to destroy his operation, the most famous Harlem drug figure of his era. That, Nicky Barnes. Queens said Bumps was comparable, not famous, not flamboyant, not the kind of man whose jewelry announced his arrival or whose cars made the neighborhood stop and stare. Comparable to Nicky Barnes in the thing that actually mattered, the operation. Federal agents who eventually tracked Bumps's activities documented something that tells the whole story without requiring any interpretation. In one 9-week period, just 9 weeks, Bumps imported $1.2 million worth of uncut heroin via Baltimore. $1.2 million in 9 weeks. Uncut. The federal agents watching him were tracking one slice of his operation, one city in a network that stretched to Detroit and Philadelphia. One 9-week window out of years of operation. That is who Ronnie Bumps Bassett was. And the whole time, young hustlers were crying out, "Hey, hey, Ronnie's over here on 150th Street." And Bumps was walking right through them, strictly about the cash. There is a teenager in this story. He grew up across the street from the Baisley projects. Both his parents worked for the Transit Authority. They wanted him to go to college. They had a future mapped out for him that had nothing to do with South Jamaica's underground economy. His name was Kenneth McGriff. By the time Kenneth McGriff was old enough to be in the streets of South Jamaica, the streets of South Jamaica were Ronnie Bumps Bassett's streets, his organization, his product, his rules. Young Kenneth McGriff started his drug career doing the most junior job in any drug operation, guarding Bumps' stash houses, standing outside a building where Bumps' product was stored, watching, waiting, learning. What he was learning, what every hour spent in the orbit of Bumps' operation was teaching him, was organizational intelligence. How a 100-person operation maintains discipline. How product moves through 9 outlets without creating chaos. How a man builds something that generates $1.2 million in 9 weeks while walking down a block so quietly that the people working for him don't even know his name. The boy guarding the stash house was absorbing everything, and he was not alone. Lorenzo Nichols, the man who would eventually run his headquarters out of Big Mac's Deli in Jamaica, who would run one of the most violent drug organizations in New York City history, who would order hits from inside a prison cell, was also in that world, hanging around, learning, absorbing. The young hustlers who would eventually define Queen's drug mythology were doing their apprenticeships in Ronnie Bumps Bassett's operation. They would become legends. Bumps would become a footnote. That is not because Bumps was smaller than them. It is because Bumps made sure he was invisible. Federal pressure arrived. The indictment came out of Baltimore, the same corridor that Bumps had used to move $1.2 million in 9 weeks. The federal government had been watching, building their case, following the money and the product through the specific geography of Bumps' multi-city network. The heat forced him out, and when Bumps stepped back, he did something that tells you everything about the kind of man he was. He didn't let the operation collapse. He handed it off. Just as Pops Freeman had once looked at the men around him and chosen Ronald Bassett, Bumps looked at the men around him and chose Lorenzo Fat Cat Nichols. He gave Nichols the Colombian connection, the direct line that Bumps had built by cutting the Italians out, the specific business relationship that had made Bumps' operation generate $1.2 million in 9 weeks, passed from Bumps to Fat Cat. Intact. The pipeline stayed open. The product kept moving. And Fat Cat, who had the Colombian connection Bumps had built, who had the organizational knowledge he had absorbed watching Bumps operate, built his own legend on the foundation Bumps had laid. His headquarters was Big Mac's Deli. His crew included Howard Pappy Mason. His organization would eventually order the murder of rookie NYPD officer Edward Byrne, a murder that triggered the largest anti-drug operation in New York City history. Fat Cat became everything Queens remembered. Bumps became the name in the fine print. And Supreme McGriff, the boy who had started his career guarding Bumps' stash houses, took what he had learned and built the Supreme Team, $200,000 per day at their 1987 peak. Life imprisonment without the possibility of parole when the government finally finished building its case against him. The Supreme Team became hip-hop mythology. 50 Cent built his entire early career partly on the specific gravity of their story. Ghetto Quran, Ja Rule, Murder Inc. The specific ecosystem that produced one of the most important moments in hip-hop history ran through the Supreme Team, which ran through Fat Cat, which ran through Bumps. In 2002, Curtis Jackson, the rapper who called himself 50 Cent, released a mixtape track called Ghetto Quran. The song was a tribute to the Queens street legends who had shaped the borough that produced him. It named names: Fat Cat, Supreme, Prince, Tony Montana, and one name that most listeners did not recognize: Ronnie Bumps. 50 Cent knew who built the foundation. He grew up in South Jamaica knowing the same oral history that every South Jamaica street kid absorbed, the lineage from Pops Freeman to Bumps to Fat Cat to Supreme. He put Bumps in the verse, not as the main character, not as the headline, as the reference that told the initiated listener something important, that the men who became famous were standing on someone else's shoulders, that the architect of Queen's entire underground mythology was a man who walked through his own operation like a ghost, visible to everyone, known to the young hustlers on 150th Street, but invisible to the world outside that geography. Strictly about the cash, never about the fame. December 2009. Ronnie Bumps Bassett is not a young man anymore. The era that produced him, the South Jamaica Queens of the late 1970s and early 1980s, the world of Pops Freeman and Italian mob pipelines and Colombian direct connections, is 30 years in the past. Fat Cat is serving 40 years. Supreme McGriff is serving life without the possibility of parole. The men who built on Bumps' foundation were swallowed by the federal system that eventually comes for everyone who stays in the game long enough. Bumps should have been finished, should have been the old man who had stepped back, who had passed the torch, who had done his time and found his way to something else. But the DEA was listening to a phone, and on that phone, Ronnie Bumps Bassett's voice, still in it. Federal agents had tapped his line and documented his involvement in a heroin distribution conspiracy involving approximately 20 other individuals. 7 kilograms of heroin seized, nearly $500,000 in cash. At his sentencing, the federal government translated 30 years of operation into a single number, 210 months, 17 and a half years. At an age when most men from his era were either dead or done, Ronnie Bumps Bassett received a sentence that would take him deep into old age. The fine the government attached was almost insulting in its smallness. $17,500, $1,000 for every year of the sentence. For a man who had imported $1.2 million of uncut heroin in 9 weeks. For the man who had built the organization that trained Fat Cat and Supreme and the entire generation of Queens drug royalty that followed. The government's accounting didn't capture what Bumps actually cost them, what Bumps actually cost the streets, what Bumps actually built. South Jamaica, Queens. Today, the names people remember are the names of the men who were loud: Fat Cat, Supreme, Prince, Tony Montana, the men who ran their organizations visibly, who made their presence felt, who generated the kind of stories, the violence, the court cases, the FBI surveillance, the hip-hop connections that become mythology. Those men are in books, in documentaries, in rap songs. The man who built them, the man who trained them, who gave Fat Cat the Colombian connection, who created the organizational environment that young Kenneth McGriff learned to be the supreme team in, walks through history like he walked through 150th Street. Like a ghost. Hey, Ronnie's over here. And Bumps kept walking. He didn't want the credit, didn't want the fame, didn't want the kind of visibility that turns a man into a target for rivals, for law enforcement, for the federal indictments that eventually arrive for everyone who announces themselves. He wanted the cash. He got it. He also got 17 and a half years in his old age, because the streets have a specific memory. They remember the men who built them even when history doesn't. The DEA remembered Ronnie Bumps Bassett in 2009 because the men who study criminal organizations understand something that the mythology around Fat Cat and Supreme never fully captured. Before there was a Supreme team, before there was Fat Cat's empire, before any of it, There was a man from Hollis who looked like the guy from Superfly, who walked down 150th Street while young hustlers paid homage to him, who cut the Italian mob out of Queens' drug trade and went direct to Colombia, who trained Kenneth McGriff, who gave Fat Cat the Connect, who built the foundation that an entire generation of Queen Street legends built their mythologies on, and who never, not once, asked for the credit. That is Ronnie Bumps Bassett, the man Queens forgot, the man without whom Queens as we know it never exists. Subscribe to Bloody Reports. There are 1,000 stories like this one that nobody